Ralph Cudworth. The Reverend Professor Ralph Cudworth FRS, 1617, June 26, 1688, was an English Anglican clergyman, Christian Hebraist, classicist, theologian and philosopher, and a leading figure among the Cambridge Platonists. From a family background embedded in the early nonconformist environment of Emmanuel College where he studied, 1630–45, he became 11th Regius Professor of Hebrew, 1645–88, 26th Master of Clare Hall, 1645–54, and 14th Master of Christ's College, 1654–88. He was a leading opponent of Thomas Hobbes's political and philosophical views, and his magnum opus was his The True Intellectual System of the Universe, 1678. Family background. Ancestry. Cudworth's family reputedly originated in Cudworth, near Barnsley, Yorkshire, moving to Lancashire with the marriage, circa 1377, of John de Cudworth, d. 1384, and Marjorie, d. 1384, daughter of Richard de Oldham, living 1354, Lord of the Manor of Werneth, Oldham. The Cudworths of Werneth Hall, Oldham, were lords of the Manor of Werneth/Oldham, until 1683. Ralph Cudworth, the philosopher's father, Ralph Cudworth, Sr., was the posthumous-born second son of Ralph Cudworth, d. 1572, of Werneth Hall, Oldham. The Reverend Dr. Ralph Cudworth Sr., 1572–1624. The philosopher's father, the Reverend Dr. Ralph Cudworth, 1572–1624, was educated at Emmanuel College, Cambridge, where he graduated B.A., 1592–93, M.A., 1596. Emmanuel College, founded by Sir Walter Mildmay, 1584, and under the direction of its first master, Lawrence Chatterton, was, from its inception, a stronghold of reformist, Puritan and Calvinist teaching, which shaped the development of Puritan ministry, and contributed largely to the emigrant ministry in America. Ordained in 1599 and elected to a college fellowship by 1600, Cudworth Sr. was much influenced by William Perkins, whom he succeeded, in 1602, as lecturer of the parish church of St. Andrew the Great, Cambridge. He was awarded the degree of Bachelor of Divinity in 1603. He edited Perkins's commentary on St. Paul's Epistle to the Galatians, 1604, with a dedication to Robert, 3rd Lord Rich, later 1st Earl of Warwick, adding a commentary of his own with dedication to Sir Basing-born Gaudy. Lord Rich presented him to the Vicariate of Coggeshall, Essex, 1606, to replace the deprived minister Thomas Stoughton, but he resigned this position, March 1608, and was licensed to preach from the pulpit by the Chancellor and scholars of the University of Cambridge, November 1609. He then applied for the Rectoriate of Alay, Somerset, an Emmanuel College living, and, resigning his fellowship, was appointed to it in 1610. His marriage, 1611, to Mary Matchell, circa 1582–1634, who had been nutrix, nurse, or preceptor, to Henry Frederick, Prince of Wales, brought important connections. Cudworth Sr. was appointed as one of James I's chaplains. Mary's mother, or aunt, was the sister of Sir Edward Lunar, a central figure, with the German and Higham families, among the Puritan East Anglian gentry, whose children had attended Emmanuel College. Mary's Lunar and Matchell connections with the Rich family included her first cousin Sir Nathaniel Rich and his sister Dame Margaret Roth, wife of Sir Thomas Roth of Petherton Park near Bridgewater, Somerset, influential promoters of colonial enterprise, and later of nonconformist immigration, in New England. Alay was immediately within their sphere. Ralph Sr. and Mary settled at Alay, where their children, listed below, were christened during the following decade. Cudworth continued to study, working on a complete survey of case divinity, the cases of conscience in family, church and commonwealth while suffering from the aguish climate at Alay. He was awarded the degree of Doctor of Divinity, 1619, and was among the dedicatees of Richard Bernard's 1621 edition of The Faithful Shepherd. Ralph Sr. died at Alay declaring a nuncupative will, August 7, 1624, before Anthony Erbry and Dame Margaret Roth. Children. The children of Ralph Cudworth Sr. and Mary, née Matchell, Cudworth, circa 1582–1634, were. Career. Education. The second son, and third of 5, probably 6, children, Ralph Cudworth, Jr., was born at Halle, Somerset, where he was baptized, July 13, 1617. Following the death of his father, Ralph Cudworth Sr., 1624, the Reverend Dr. John Stoughton, 1593–1639, son of Thomas Stoughton of Coggeshall, also a Fellow of Emmanuel College, succeeded as rector of Halle, and married the widow Mary, née Matchell, Cudworth, c. 1582–1634. Dr. Stoughton paid careful attention to his stepchildren's education, which Ralph later described as a diet of Calvinism. Letters to Stoughton, by both brothers James and Ralph Cudworth, make this plain, and, when Ralph matriculated at Emmanuel College, Cambridge, 1632, Stoughton thought him as well grounded in show learning as any boy of his age that went to the university. Stoughton was appointed curate and preacher at St. Mary Aldermanbury, London, 1632, and the family left Halle. Ralph's elder brother, James Cudworth, married and emigrated to Scituate, Plymouth Colony, New England, 1634. Mary Matchell Cudworth Stoughton died during summer 1634, and Dr. Stoughton married a daughter of John Brown of Frampton and Dorchester. Pensioner, student and Fellow of Emmanuel College, 1630–45. A diligent student, Cudworth was admitted, as a pensioner, to Emmanuel College, Cambridge, 1630, matriculated, 1632, and graduated, B.A., 1635/6, M.A., 1639. After some misgivings, which he confided in his stepfather, he was elected a Fellow of Emmanuel, 1639, and became a successful tutor, delivering the Reed Lecture, 1641. He published a tract entitled The Union of Christ and the Church, in a Shadow, 1642, and another, A Discourse Concerning the True Notion of the Lord's Supper, 1642, in which his readings of Karaite manuscripts, stimulated by meetings with Johann Stephan Rittingel, were influential. 11th Regius Professor of Hebrew, 1645, and 26th Master of Clare Hall, 1645–54. Following sustained correspondence with John Selden, to whom he supplied Karaite literature, he was elected, age 28, as 11th Regius Professor of Hebrew, 1645. In 1645, Thomas Pace had been ejected as Master of Clare Hall for his Anglican allegiances, and Cudworth, despite his immaturity, was selected as his successor, as 26th Master, but not admitted until 1650. Similarly, his fellow theologian Benjamin Whichcote was installed as 19th Provost of King's College. Cudworth attained the degree of Bachelor of Divinity, 1646, and preached a sermon before the House of Commons of England, on 1 John 2, 3–4, which was later published with a letter of dedication to the House, 1647. Despite these distinctions and his presentation, by Emmanuel College, to the Rectoriate of North Cadbury, Somerset, October 3, 1650, he remained comparatively impoverished. He was awarded the degree of Doctor of Divinity, 1651, and, in January 1651 halves, his friend Dr. John Worthington wrote of him, if through want of maintenance he should be forced to leave Cambridge, for which place he is so eminently accomplished with what is noble and exemplarily academical, it would be an ill omen. Marriage, 1654, and 14th Master of Christ's College, 1654–88. Cudworth was elected, October 29, 1654, and admitted, November 2, 1654, as 14th Master of Christ's College. His appointment coincided with his marriage to Damaris, d. 1695, daughter, by his first wife, Damaris, of Matthew Craddock, d. 1641, first governor of the Massachusetts Bay Company. Hence Worthington commented, after many tossings Dr. Cudworth is through God's good providence returned to Cambridge and settled in Christ's College, and by his marriage more settled and fixed. In his will, 1641, Matthew Craddock had divided his estate beside the Mystic River at Medford, Massachusetts, which he had never visited, and was managed on his behalf, into two moieties. One was bequeathed to his daughter Damaris Craddock, d. 1695, later wife of Ralph Cudworth Jr., and one was to be enjoyed by his widow Rebecca, during her lifetime, and afterwards to be inherited by his brother, Samuel Craddock, 1583–1653, and his heirs male. Samuel Craddock's son, Samuel Craddock Jr., 1621–1706, was admitted to Emmanuel, 1637, graduated, B.A., 1640-1, M.A., 1644, B.D., 1651, was later a Fellow, 1645-56, and pupil of Benjamin Whichcote. After part of the Medford estate was rented to Edward Collins, 1642, it was placed in the hands of an attorney, the widow Rebecca Craddock, whose second and third husbands were Richard Glover and Benjamin Whichcote, respectively, petitioned the General Court of Massachusetts, and the legatees later sold the estate to Collins, 1652. The marriage of the widow Rebecca Craddock to Cudworth's colleague Benjamin Whichcote laid the way for the union between Cudworth and her stepdaughter, Damaris, d. 1695, thereby reinforcing the connections between the two scholars through a familial bond. Damaris had married, firstly, 1642, Thomas Andrews Jr., d. 1653, of London and Feltham, son of Sir Thomas Andrews, d. 1659, Lord Mayor of London, 1649, 1651-2, which union had produced several children. The Andrews family were also engaged in the Massachusetts Project, and strongly supported Puritan causes. Commonwealth and Restoration. Cudworth emerged as a central figure among that circle of theologians and philosophers known as the Cambridge Platonists, who were, more or less, in sympathy with the Commonwealth. During the later 1650s, Cudworth was consulted by John Thurlow, Oliver Cromwell's secretary to the Council of State, with regard to certain university and government appointments and various other matters. During 1657, Cudworth advised Bulstrode Whitelock's subcommittee of the Parliamentary Grand Committee for Religion on the accuracy of editions of the English Bible. Cudworth was appointed Vicar of Great Wilbraham, and Rector of Toft, Cambridgeshire Diocese, 1656, but surrendered these livings, 1661 and 1662, respectively, when he was presented, by Dr. Gilbert Shelton, Bishop of London, to the Hertfordshire Rectory of Ashwell, December 1, 1662. Given Cudworth's close cooperation with prominent figures in Oliver Cromwell's regime, such as John Thurlow, Cudworth's continuance as Master of Christ's was challenged at the Restoration, but, ultimately, he retained this post until his death. He and his family are believed to have resided in private lodgings at the Old Lodge, which stood between Hobson Street and the College Chapel, and various improvements were made to the college rooms in his time. Later life. In 1665, Cudworth almost quarreled with his fellow Platonist, Henry More, because of the latter's composition of an ethical work which Cudworth feared would interfere with his own long-contemplated treatise on the same subject. To avoid any difficulties, More published his Enchiridion Ethicum, 1666-69. In Latin, however, Cudworth's planned treatise was never published. His own majestic work, The True Intellectual System of the Universe, 1678, was conceived in 3 parts, of which only the first was completed. He wrote, "There is no reason why this volume should therefore be thought imperfect and incomplete, because it hath not all the 3 things at first designed by us, it containing all that belongeth to its own particular title and subject, and being in that respect no piece, but a whole." Cudworth was installed as Prebendary of Gloucester, 1678. His colleague, Benjamin Whichcote, died at Cudworth's house in Cambridge, 1683, and Cudworth himself died, June 26, 1688, and was buried in the chapel of Christ's College. An oil portrait of Cudworth, from life, hangs in the hall of Christ's College. During Cudworth's time an outdoor swimming pool was created at Christ's College, which still exists, and a carved bust of Cudworth there accompanies those of John Milton and Nicholas Saunderson. Cudworth's widow, Damaris, née Craddock, Andrews Cudworth, d. 1695, maintained close connections with her daughter, Damaris Cudworth Masham, at High Laver, Essex, which was where she died, and was commemorated in the church with a carved epitaph reputedly composed by the philosopher John Locke. Children. The children of Ralph Cudworth and Damaris, née Craddock, Andrews Cudworth, d. 1695, were the stepchildren of Ralph Cudworth, children of Damaris, née Craddock, Andrews, d. 1695, and Thomas Andrews, d. 1653, were works. Sermons and treatises. Cudworth's works included The Union of Christ and the Church, In a Shadow, 1642, a sermon preached before the House of Commons, 1647, and A Discourse Concerning the True Notion of the Lord's Supper, 1670. Much of Cudworth's work remains in manuscript. However, certain surviving works have been published posthumously, such as A Treatise Concerning Eternal and Immutable Morality, and A Treatise of Free Will. A Treatise Concerning Eternal and Immutable Morality, Vost. Cudworth's Treatise on Eternal and Immutable Morality, published with a preface by Edward Chandler, 1731, is about the historical development of British moral philosophy. It answers, from the standpoint of Platonism, Hobbes's famous doctrine that moral distinctions are created by the state, just as knowledge contains a permanent intelligible element over and above the flux of sense impressions, so there exist eternal and immutable ideas of morality. Cudworth's ideas, like those of Plato, have a constant and never-failing entity of their own, such as we see in geometrical figures, but, unlike Plato's ideas, they exist in the mind of God, whence they are communicated to finite understandings. Hence it is evident that wisdom, knowledge and understanding are eternal and self-subsistent things, superior to matter and all sensible beings, and independent upon them, and so also are moral good and evil. Cudworth does not attempt to give any list of moral ideas. It is, indeed, the cardinal weakness of this form of intuitionism that no satisfactory list can be given, and that no moral principles have the constant and never-failing entity, or the definiteness, of the concepts of geometry. These attacks are not uncontested. For example, see Common Sense Tradition from Thomas Reid to James McCush and the Oxford realists Harold Pritchard and Sir William David Ross. Henry Moore's Enchiridion Ethicum attempts to enumerate the Nemata Moralia, but, so far from being self-evident, most of his moral axioms are open to serious controversy. A Treatise of Free Will, Vost. Another posthumous publication was Cudworth's A Treatise of Free Will, edited by John Allen, 1838. Both this and the Treatise on Eternal and Immutable Morality are connected with the design of his magnum opus, The True Intellectual System of the Universe. The True Intellectual System of the Universe, 1678. In 1678, Cudworth published The True Intellectual System of the Universe, the first part, wherein all the reason and philosophy of atheism is confuted and its impossibility demonstrated, which had been given an imprimatur for publication, May 29, 1671. The intellectual system arose, so Cudworth informs us, from a discourse refuting fatal necessity, or determinism. Enlarging his plan, he proposed to prove three matters. These three comprise, collectively, the intellectual, as opposed to the physical, system of the universe, and they are opposed, respectively, by three false principles: atheism, religious fatalism, which refers all moral distinctions to the will of God, and the fatalism of the ancient Stoics, who recognized God and yet identified him with nature. The immense fragment dealing with atheism was all that was published, perhaps because of the theological clamor raised against this first part. Cudworth criticizes two main forms of materialistic atheism: the atomic, adopted by Democritus, Epicurus and Hobbes, and the hylozoic, attributed to Strato of Lampsacus, which explains everything by the supposition of an inward self-organizing life in matter. Atomic atheism is by far the more important, if only because Hobbes, the great antagonist whom Cudworth always has in view, is supposed to have held this view. It arises from the combination of two principles, neither of which is, individually, atheistic, namely atomism and corporealism, or the doctrine that nothing exists but body. The example of Stoicism, as Cudworth suggests, shows that corporealism may be theistic. Cudworth plunges into the history of atomism with vast erudition. It is, in its purely physical application, a theory that he fully accepts. He holds that atomism was taught by Pythagoras, Empedocles, and, in fact, nearly all the ancient philosophers, and was only perverted to atheism by Democritus. Cudworth believes that atomism was first invented before the Trojan War by a Sidonian thinker named Moschus or Mochus, identical with Moses in the Old Testament. In dealing with atheism, Cudworth's method was to marshal the atheistic arguments elaborately, so elaborately that Dryden remarked he has raised such objections against the being of a God and providence that many think he has not answered them. Then, in his last chapter, which, by itself, is the length of an ordinary treatise, he confutes the arguments with all the reasons that his reading could supply. A subordinate matter in the book which attracted much attention at the time was the conception of the plastic medium, a mere revival of Plato's world soul, which is intended to explain the existence and laws of nature without referring to the direct operation of God, which occasioned a long-drawn controversy between Pierre Bayle and Leclerc, the former maintaining, the latter denying, that the plastic medium is favorable to atheism. Commentary on Cudworth. Andrew Dixon White wrote in his A History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom, 1896, with Theology in Christendom, 1896, with Theology in Christendom, 1896,